But this one was recurring all weekend. And are you saying that the days in the creation story are different than the days that we understand as far as it being a seven or actual 24-hour period days of creation as it relates to you referring to the galaxy being billions of years old?
Sure.
How do you do that?
Well, Genesis 1 is speaking about God creating in 6 literal days. He takes 6 literal days to transform the earth so that we human beings can thrive here. But the Hebrew word yom, that's translated as day, has 4 distinct literal definitions. Part of the daylight hours, all of the daylight hours, a 24-hour period, or a long but finite period of time. Now, I didn't really pick up a Bible to read it seriously until I was 17 years of age. But the first time I picked it up, I noticed that in Genesis, it uses 3 of those 4 definitions. Creation day 1 is contrasting days and nights. That's day for the daylight hours. Creation day 4, it's seasons, days, and years. That's day for 24 hours. Genesis 2:4 uses the word day to refer to the entirety of creation history. That's day as a long period of time. But at age 17, 8 years before I really got to know a Christian, I was able to quickly conclude these days of creation must be 6 literal long periods of time. Why? Because there's no evening and morning for the 7th day. Now, part of my story is I got interested in astronomy when I was 7, and my parents noticed I was bringing home 5 books per weekend from the Vancouver Public Library on physics and astronomy. And by the time I got to be 10, they thought I was being obsessive about physics and astronomy. I don't know why they drew that conclusion. But they wound up buying our family this big, thick book on evolutionary biology. It was about that thick. I was the only one in the family that read it. But I went to my parents and said, Mom, Dad, the numbers don't add up. There's all this speciation before humanity and hardly any afterwards. What's the answer? And they said, go ask your science teachers. I asked the science teachers, and they said, well, those professors at the university, go talk to them. I talked to them, they didn't have any idea. Age 17, I pick up Genesis. For 6 days God creates, on the 7th day he rests. He stops his work of creation. And we're still in that 7th day, and I said, that answers the fossil record enigma. The reason why we see all the speciation before humanity, those are the 6 days that God creates. The reason we don't see it today, it's the 7th day when God rests from his work of creation. And so that was a huge breakthrough for me, seeing that resolution of the fossil record paradox just on the very first page of the Bible. But again, what makes it all work is realizing we're talking 6 literal days of creation, where each of those days is a finite long period of time. Now, if you want to read about it, I've written a book called A Matter of Days. It's not here, but you can get that from us at reasons.org.
Hey, sorry, it's me again. So if I were to walk into a room, I have a deck of cards in my hand, I close my eyes and throw the cards and they all land out somewhere, and then I leave. Later, someone else comes in the room, they see all the cards on the ground, and they look at them and they say, wow, look at how all these cards landed. Look at that one right there. It's face up and it's exactly 30 degrees different from this one. And they conclude that, well, the odds of all these cards landing how they did, God must have done that toss of the cards. That's the only way that they could have all landed this way. So you see the error in the logic right there. And when we make these fine-tuning arguments of the universe, it's tempting at face level to think like, well, that sounds just a lot like the analogy I just made with the card throwing. We're looking at how everything landed, and then we're coming in after the fact and saying, wow, only God must have done this, but then someone else could say, well, no, that's just how it all resulted. That's just where the cards laid, right? So how do you resolve that?
Well, the question you're asking is a very famous and common response from people that reject the fine-tuning argument for God. And they'll phrase it like, well, every hand in poker has got the same probability of coming up. And so what makes you think this fine-tuning argument gives us any evidence for God? Well, I take them back to those poker hands. and make the point, well, notice that there's over 2 million possible junk hands that for sure are going to lose you money at the poker table. Whereas royal flush, there's only 4 possibilities. And the whole point is there, the royal flushes serve the purpose that they're going to win you the pot, whereas these millions of other poker hands basically are not going to win you the pot. And the whole point is, it's not just that we see fine-tuning, it's fine-tuning for a purpose. And that purpose is to make possible the existence of us humans. And what is interesting is the fine-tuning evidence goes up as you go from what kind of fine-tuning do you need for bacteria, what kind of fine-tuning do you need for bacteria to be here for 3 billion years, what kind of fine-tuning do you need for plants, for animals, and as we've got to human beings, the fine-tuning evidence gets higher and higher and higher in a very dramatic way, which means that God's got a more targeted purpose for humans than he does for bacteria. But what I've noticed is if you go from the fine-tuning you need for humans to exist to the fine-tuning you need for billions of humans to be redeemed from evil, it skyrockets. So it basically shows you where the purpose lies. In other words, fine-tuning can actually help you see God's purpose behind it, but God's purpose behind it tells you the fine-tuning is not an accident. Now, this is not unique to me. It goes back 30 years ago to the British philosopher Richard Swinburne. He was responding to the idea, well, of course the universe is fine-tuned. There wouldn't be observers unless it was fine-tuned. And he says, well, here's the fallacy in that argument. And he came up with an analogy. You're condemned to die by a firing squad, and 12 sharpshooters have their rifles aimed at your heart from 30 feet away. They pull the trigger, and you survive. And you say, well, of course I survived. They all missed. But what you're missing is the only way they would have all missed is if they purposed that you would survive. Either somebody put blanks in their guns, or they all said, you know, we don't want to kill a guy, they point their guns away. There's no way you're going to survive unless someone purposed that you would survive. Likewise, he says the only rational way to explain the fine-tuning, someone must have purposed that we humans would be alive in the universe. But again, what I think is particularly dramatic is how exponentially greater the fine-tuning evidence is when you put it in the context of redemption.
I have a question from the men's breakfast about inbreeding. So obviously that wasn't a problem in the beginning. When did that become a problem? Was it when the populations were scattered and there was less in the gene pool, they were smaller? If you could just elaborate on that, and
Sure.
I'll take my answer in my chair.
Okay, well, I'm going to give you both a biblical answer and a scientific answer. What you notice in the book of Genesis is that you see that brother-sister marriages are condoned. Abraham, for example, was married to his half-sister. But by the time you get to Exodus, it's now forbidden for brothers and sisters to marry. And Moses explains why, so that we will not have the diseases of the Egyptians. And if you know anything about ancient Egyptian history, the line of the pharaohs, they thought the pharaohs were gods, and gods are only permitted to marry gods, and so the pharaoh only had one option, which was to marry his sister. Now, here's a scientific answer. In animal breeding, we know that we can breed brothers and sisters without risk of a genetic defect for 20 consecutive generations. And sometimes it's 18 generations, sometimes 22, but roughly 20. After that, you've got to stop doing it. And this is a technique that's used in animal breeding to get certain breeds that they want. Well, the same thing's true of humans. In other words, the reason why it's not a problem in the book of Exodus is there hasn't been enough repeated generations of brother-sister marriages to make it a genetic risk. But by the time you get to the book of Exodus, it's now a significant risk. Now, what you notice is that there's always been a moral prohibition against parents marrying their children. That's always been forbidden. It's been forbidden for moral reasons that the book of Leviticus talks about. Brother-sister marriages are not a moral law. It's basically a health law. And there are parts of America today where we'd probably be wise not to let first cousins marry because of how repeatedly they've been marrying, and there's a risk of genetic defects. But for most of the states, it's not illegal for first cousins to marry because of how infrequently that happens. So yeah, it's all based on health rather than morality. Somebody did marry their sister in order to get the human species going.
There's one that came in light of the fine-tuning that you're explaining, the incredible detail of creation. Why would God introduce then evil to the situation like the Bible reveals?
Well, I argue that God on purpose arranged it so that the most powerful being he created was the first one to sin, namely Satan. Also on purpose, he gave access to Satan to the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve. By permitting Satan to come into the Garden of Eden, he was exposing Adam and Eve, and through them, the rest of us, to the most powerful tests in the context of evil. Because God's goal for humanity is that we would retain our free will and actually have our free will enhanced, but eliminate the possibility we'd ever use our free will for evil intents. And the only way that's possible is if we pass the most challenging test in the context of evil. And so the fact that we've been exposed to the temptation of Satan, he's the most powerful being that God created. If we can pass that test, there is no other test that can be as challenging as that one. And that's how God grants us eternal security, by exposing us to the most difficult tests. And if you read the book of Revelation, notice no one gets to the new creation without being exposed to temptation from Satan. What you read in Revelation 20, for example, is at the end of this millennial reign that Revelation speaks about, Christ releases Satan from his prison and gives him permission to test the children born during the millennium who have not been tested by Satan, because no one can enter the new creation unless they've been exposed to the most difficult tests and have passed that most difficult test. The analogy I gave yesterday is how I have a PhD degree, and that PhD guarantees that never again will I have to be tested for my competency in astrophysics based on the belief that I've been exposed to the most difficult tests, so it's pointless to test me again. And I remember our professors sitting us graduate students down the first day we arrived at the University of Toronto. There were 13 of us, and they said, "You 13 are the cream of the crop. We know you're prepared to work hard. We know you're all really intelligent, but the course of studies we're taking you through here is so challenging, none of you will pass, no matter how brilliant you are, no matter how hard you work, unless you get our help. We professors are here to help you. You can come into our offices at any time, but we're telling you, if you don't seek our help, you're not going to make it." Well, 7 of the 13 of us did not make it. And I know a few of those that didn't make it did not get the help that was offered by the professors. Well, likewise, God comes to each of us and says, if you try to pass this test in your own strength, you will fail. But I'm here to help you. And unlike my professors, God is guaranteeing if we seek his help, we will pass the test. My professors didn't give me a guarantee. So yeah, the answer is Satan is crucial for us to gain an eternally secure, loving relationship with our Creator.
This is related back to Wes's question to you earlier. In the Word it says that one day to us is 1,000 years to God. So on the creation, was each day 1,000 years?
Okay, that comes from Psalm 90, where it says 1,000 years is like a day for the Lord. A day is like 1,000 years. 1,000 years is like a watch in the night. A watch in the night is either 3 hours or 4 hours. The key point here is God is contrasting 1,000 years with 24 hours and 1,000 years with 3 or 4 hours. Psalm 90 is making the point that God can arbitrarily compress time or expand time. I mentioned this in the first service this morning. And it's basically making the point, I can do this because I'm not limited to a single dimension of time. If God has access to the equivalent of 2 dimensions of time, he can take any time frame in our realm and squish it down as much as he wants and expands it as much as he wants. Therefore, I think it's a mistake to look at Psalm 90 as an equation. It's not saying that our 24 hours is like exactly 1,000 years for God. It's saying our 24 hours can be any period of time God wants. And so people often ask me, well, given that you see all this biblical evidence that these creation days are long periods of time, how long are they? Well, when I compare it with the established scientific record, what I note is each of the 6 creation days gets shorter and shorter as you go from day 1 to day 6. The way the grammar is structured, the days must be consecutive without gaps between them, but there's nothing in the text that says the days all have to be equal periods of time. And yeah, compared to the scientific record, the 6th day is much shorter in time than the 1st day.
What I want to say is I have not yet read your book, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men. Have you ever seen a little green man?
I've never personally had an encounter with a little green man or with a UFO, but I can tell you I've met lots of people who have. And that was especially the case when I was on a couple of speaking tours in the Soviet Union when the communists were still running the show. It's like literally thousands of people I met had close encounters with UFOs and very scary encounters with UFOs. And so I was speaking there on how you can prevent those kinds of experiences from happening in your life. The only way you're going to have these experiences is if you've got significant open doors to the occult. The more doors you got open, the higher the probability you're going to have these kinds of encounters with, quote, the little green men, the flying saucers, or these demonic agents. But if you close all those doors, that will be the end of your UFO experiences. In the last chapter of Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, I said, our hypothesis is scientifically testable. Open the doors, this is going to happen to you. Close the doors, it'll never happen to you. The reason I've never had those experiences, the doors have not been open. However, I do have a relative for whom the doors were open, and yeah, that relative was having experiences.
Okay, I'm going to go on here to this next question, and it's global warming. And if we could just get your thoughts on global warming, can we have significant impact upon stopping global warming? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm working on a book right now. I just got started on a week ago that's going to be targeting global warming and actually makes the point how global warming always leads to global cooling. We're living in an ice age cycle, and the way the ice age cycle works is whenever the global mean temperature rises by 2 degrees centigrade above where it is right now, we drop rapidly into an ice age. And the book I'm working on actually explains why that happens. It's going to be a while before the book is out, but hey, I've already got some blog articles on our reasons.org website that explains why that happens, and those are all accessible for free. It's called Today's New Reason to Believe, so you can go there. But I've also written in Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job, number 1, global warming is real. Number 2, we don't know exactly what the cause of that global warming is. Certainly we humans have made a contribution, but they're a natural process in operation as well. But then also I talk about how we can take the politics and the polarization out of the global warming debate. And if you've been reading Al Gore's material, for example, he's making the point that global warming is such a serious problem that we need to make really big economic sacrifices to deal with global warming. So for example, he advocated we need to ban all automobiles and we need to shut down factories in order to prevent too much greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. The problem with that is the Bible tells us we humans are selfish, we are sinners, and trying to encourage everybody in the world to make do with a much lower standard of living and less wealth, that's a hard sell. And so that explains the political divide we have. So for example, we got politicians in Washington that are pushing for these economic sacrifices, and we got other politicians basically saying that's not going to work. We need to actually value the economic well-being of the American population. What I've written in Hidden Treasures in the book of Job, God has designed our planet in such a way that when we face a crisis, in obeying the command to manage the planet's resources for the benefit of all life, in advance He's provided solutions that are optimally ethical and optimally economic. And therefore we need to seek those solutions out. And I give 3 examples of how that could work for global warming. Number 1, we could shrink the size of the Gobi Desert and the Sahara Desert. During the times of the Romans, the Sahara Desert was only 10% the size that it is today. During the days of the Roman Empire, the food that fed Europe came from what is now the Sahara Desert. Today, it feeds nobody. However, we can replant the Sahara Desert. And the reason why the Sahara Desert has gotten so big, the sub-Saharan peoples have been stripping it of vegetation for cooking fuel. So one of the proposals I made in Hidden Treasures in the book of Job, incidentally, the book is not at the table. If you want it, you'll have to go to reasons.org, is that we could supply the sub-Saharan peoples with all the kerosene they want free of charge on the condition they work with us to replant the Sahara Desert. How quickly could that be done? In 1 or 2 generations. We can actually rapidly reverse the 2,000 years of damage that we have done. And if we were to do that, we could plant that with wheat, and we could grow a huge amount of food, and all that wheat would soak up huge quantities of greenhouse gases, so it helped cool the planet and at the same time provide a huge amount of income for those African peoples and help secure the food resources for the planet. I got 2 more solutions in the book. I'm not going to take the time to describe them, but it talks about whales and ostriches and other solutions as well. Anyway.
Hi, my question is about, is there any scientific evidence or explanation for why the people in Genesis, like Adam, lived such a long period of time, maybe biologically or the way the planet or the universe worked?
Okay, good question. I know you all heard that. Is there an explanation for how people in the days before Noah could live to be 800 or 900 years? And yes, we cover that in chapter 13 of Navigating Genesis, and it is out there at the table. And I also think we're giving away a free chapter of that book. Again, go to reasons.org/Ross. But in chapter 13, I talk about how one of the big limitations on our lifespan is that we have to deal with cosmic rays. Matter of fact, I'm going to be flying home this afternoon and going through Denver. If you live in Denver, your life expectancy is shortened by 3 months because of your additional exposure to cosmic rays. But one thing astronomers have discovered is that in the days before Noah, there was a gigantic nearby supernova eruption, and that one supernova eruption is responsible for 95% of the killer cosmic rays. And consequently, in the days before that supernova eruption, people were exposed to much less dangerous cosmic rays and therefore could live longer. Now, that's one factor. Another factor is we need to be protected from uranium and thorium in the crust of the earth. That uranium and thorium resides in igneous rocks. And today, all of us are exposed to igneous rocks, and that limits your lifespan. But notice in the days before Noah, humanity was only living in sedimentary plains. And if they weren't exploiting igneous rocks to make concrete and skyscrapers, they would have been much more protected from that radioactive decay than we are today. Notice the text also says for the people living before the flood, don't eat meat. If you're going to eat meat and live 800 years, the extra metals you'll accumulate will kill you. I'm not saying you have to be vegetarian. If you're only going to live to be 120 years, it doesn't matter how much meat you eat, though you might want to avoid certain brands of Japanese tuna, but other than that, it shouldn't be an issue. So, and then finally, our chromosomes get shorter and shorter as we get older and older. and that fundamentally limits our lifespan to 120 years. But actually, that increases our lifespan. If our chromosomes were not getting shorter and shorter as we got older and older, we'd be dying from cancer at much earlier ages. So it actually is a guard to allow us to live long enough that cancer doesn't become a source of death for people in their 20s and 30s. But if you don't have the cosmic rays or the uranium and thorium decay, then the cancer risk is a whole lot lower, and therefore God could have a telomerase activity where the chromosomes are getting shorter at a much less aggressive rate. Anyway, we want the details and documentation of the scientific literature. It's all in chapter 13 of Navigating Genesis.
So I was just skimming through the table of contents of one of your books I purchased, and a couple of those sections, overemphasis of free will and overemphasis of God's sovereignty or lack of free will or whatnot. And I know you mentioned at the end of last service how that's a huge debate, not only with Christians, but also atheists. So my question is, what's your insight when it comes to Reformed theology and that debate in our camp? I would like to get your perspective, because obviously it's from a different point of view.
I speak on seminary campuses quite frequently about the very topic of human free will and divine predestination. And basically, I'm trying to exhort these philosophers and theologians at seminary campuses that you need to look at this issue of Arminianism and Calvinism, another frame for free will and predestination, from a transdimensional perspective. Because I notice that theologians have been trying to wrestle with this issue, but looking at it in the context of length, width, height, and time. And so when I give talks in seminary campuses, is that if we actually look at it from an 11-dimensional perspective, and I don't think God is limited to just 11 space-time dimensions. I think he's got way more power than that. Then we actually have thousands, if not millions, of ways of resolving human free will and divine predestination. It's not either or, it's both and. And also there's a theological application here. If we focus too much on human free will, we get legalistic. If we focus too much on divine predestination, we get licential. And the reason why we see almost an equal number of verses in the Bible talking about divine predestination as opposed to verses talking about human free will, we all need to live this balance from a tendency towards legalism and a tendency towards license. And if we carefully walk that balance, we can actually recognize, okay, God's in charge. I don't have to worry about what God's going to do in my life. At the same time, God is holding me responsible, and I need to act as a responsible follower of God. And always, every day, kind of check that balance. I kind of look at it, like I enjoy mountaineering, and a lot of mountaineering is where you're walking on a really steep ridge, and you better stay right on top of that ridge, otherwise you're going to hurt yourself. Well, likewise, this is the theological ridge. If you move too far off, you're going to slip down the slope of legalism. Otherwise, you're going to slip down the slope of licentiousness. And so just realizing God's got multiple ways, literally thousands of ways of having us human beings with unrestrained free will, and at the same time predetermining every word, thought, and action. Hold both in context, and that will hopefully help you stay on that theological ridge.
Good answer. One that came in here is, can you give us just kind of your 1, 2, 3 of young earth creationism, the error that you see in young earth creationism?
And so what's the question again?
Why is young earth creationism wrong?
Okay. Well, the thing that concerns me most about young earth creationism is that they look at this as a fundamental doctrine of the Christian faith. And I remind my young earth friends, the age of the earth is not in any of the creeds of the church. It's not an essential of the Christian faith. And we're allowed to have different beliefs on things that are not essential to the Christian faith. For example, different denominations baptize in different ways or serve communion in different ways. It's not an essential of the Christian faith. And if we can realize this is not an essential of the Christian faith, then we can rationally dialogue with one another the biblical merits and the scientific merits of the case. But I'm convinced what's stopping this from being resolved is the fact that young earth creationists see this as an essential doctrine of the Christian faith. I mean, to give an example, I've been accused by young earth leaders as denying the doctrine of the atonement because I believe that there was plant and animal death before the fall of Adam. And my response is that's got nothing to do with the atonement. It's explicit in the book of Hebrews that only the blood of the Son of God can atone for sin. The blood of goats and cows has no benefit whatsoever for the atonement of our sin, and therefore it's got nothing to do with this debate about whether there was animal death before the fall of Adam. And really, I think the core of this debate, what I think is most wrong, is their attitude towards the scientific community. They look at the scientific community as an enemy that needs to be destroyed, whereas I look at the scientific community as a mission field that needs to be won to Christ. And I like to put this in historical context. I mean, I don't know where you have this, I got this 8-volume set by Philip Schaff on the history of the church. It's a really nice history of the first 16 centuries of the church. As you go through that, you realize every generation of the church has had a church-splitting issue that's got nothing to do with salvation. But it's got everything to do with keeping an unwelcome people group from joining the church. Now, you see the first one of these in the book of Acts, chapter 15, where you had these Jewish Christians saying, you're not a Christian unless you're circumcised. Now, this is not a salvation issue, but here is their motivation. They despised Gentiles, so they came up with a doctrine that would be odious to Gentile men. Okay, you can't come to church, you can't be a Christian unless you're circumcised. Hey, if that's what I got to do, then I'm going to go somewhere else, okay? Well, likewise, what's happened in the 20th and 21st centuries is people saying, unless you believe that the earth is 10,000 years old or younger, there's no place for you within our community. That's guaranteed to stop scientists from getting involved in the church. And I've personally seen this. In fact, our nation's most famous astrophysicist, after a 35-year search of the Bible, gave his life to Christ. However, he was terrified about being exposed in the church. He said, if they find out I'm an astronomer, they're going to ask me to leave. And I said, well, what makes you afraid of it? I said, well, my colleague, who was a Christian before I was, he's been kicked out of 4 different churches. Not because he taught that the earth was old or the universe was old, but because he simply mentioned he was an astronomer. That was enough to get them ejected from the church. And so the way we need to resolve these controversies is realize God has called us to reach every people group for faith in Jesus Christ. Now, I firmly believe this young earth, old earth issue will quickly disappear. Of course, I've been saying that for years. But when it does go away, God's going to replace it with another church-splitting controversy that's got nothing to do with salvation. You say, why has God done that for 2,000 years? 2 Corinthians 5, 18 to 20. It says there that we who are followers of Christ are ambassadors for Christ, calling unbelievers to make their peace with God. But the only way that's going to be effective is if we can make peace with one another. So I think God blesses us with these controversies that have got nothing to do with salvation in order that we can manifest our capacity to engage one another on these divisive beliefs in a manner that's loving and charitable, because non-Christians watch us. And incidentally, I'm sharing that with my non-Christian friends, saying, look, you can disagree with me, but please let's disagree in a charitable way, because non-Christians are watching us, and if they see vindictive responses, they're not going to touch us with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah. Good.
Hi. You've said a couple of different times over the weekend that the earth is not going to be able to sustain life for very much longer unless we make significant changes in several different areas. So my question is, since that's probably not going to happen, and Jesus is going to have to come back before then, how much longer do we have approximately?
Right. Well, there's certain things we can do to delay our extinction, but there's a limit. The sun is getting brighter and brighter, but fortunately at a very, very slow rate. But I can tell you, 10 million years from now, the sun will be too bright for humans to exist. And in about 30 million years, it will be too bright for bacteria to exist. So there's a fundamental limit to how long we can reside here on the planet. But we humans can only reside here if we're in an ice age cycle. And we can only maintain our high level of technology and high population if we're in an ice age cycle with extreme climate stability. And the maximum time that extreme climate stability can be sustained is about 10,500 years. And the bad news is we've already eaten up 9,000 of those 10,500 years. So that's a relatively short window of time. But I'm relatively optimistic because Jesus said, hey, as soon as my followers take the good news of salvation to all the people groups of the world where significant numbers in each people group become disciples, then I'm going to come back, and after 1,000 years, I'm going to exit all of you from this creation and take you into a brand new creation. The Bible's message is that the universe is temporal. It's a temporary tool that God uses basically to deliver us permanently from evil and suffering. So once evil and suffering are completely eradicated, there's no longer a need for the universe. God's going to replace it with a realm that's far, far better for expressing his love towards us. And I write about that and why the universe is the way it is and beyond the cosmos, basically to encourage you, it's worth every bit of our effort to get there quickly rather than slowly. And we can certainly do it in a lot less than 1,500 years. In fact, I end my book, Improbable Planet, with some reasons why I think it could be done in a single generation or less. In fact, a friend of mine, Ralph Winter, he's no longer alive, but he was the one that founded the U.S. Center for World Mission, and he wrote in his book that we evangelical Christians today have the numbers, the money, and the technology to fulfill the Great Commission in under 5 years. All we lack is the motivation. That's one reason why I'm here this weekend. I know you guys are motivated, but hopefully I can give you a little more motivation. Because, hey, wouldn't it be neat if we can get it done in 5 years?
You may have already answered my question with everything I've been listening to, but the thing that's uppermost on my mind is humanity progressed at a very slow rate for many, many years. And in just the last couple of 100 years, progress has greatly accelerated. And now, in just the last 20 to 30 years, we're seeing incredible acceleration of technology. Just explain to me, what does all this mean and where are we headed?
Okay, the biggest driver of technology has been the ratio of farmers to non-farmers. The more non-farmers we have relative to farmers, the faster technology advances. And that's been the case for the past 45,000 years. I mean, if you go back into the last ice age, about 98 to 99% of the human population was involved in coming up with enough food to survive. The percentage in the United States right now is less than 1%. And that's now becoming almost a worldwide percentage. There's still some nations of the world where, say, 10% are involved in agricultural activity, but that still sets free 90% of the population to do things like engineering, science, computer science, to do programming, to do medicine, technology. And so as that percentage of non-farmers to farmers grows, we see technology advancing at a progressively more and more rapid rate. And a lot of it is thanks to what they call the Green Revolution, where we're able to produce food far more efficiently than what we were able to do even a couple of decades ago.
But where are we headed, is what I'm asking.
Where are we headed? Well, there will come a time when we can no longer advance technology at the pace we're advancing today. You know, Fuzz, when he spoke yesterday, made the point that we're coming up with a data storage crisis, that eventually we're not going to have enough silicon available to store all of our computer data. And in fact, there are scientists, basically, because we scientists really can produce a lot of data. But it's such that a number of scientists are now saying we need to pass laws to stop people from posting all these photos in the cloud and all these video clips of their pets, so that we can actually have enough data available to store all the scientific stuff we want to store. And there's calculations showing we could hit that data limit literally within a few decades. But Fuzz was speaking about the fact that we can somehow use DNA computers, we can get past that limitation. But even then, there's a limit. Given that our knowledge base is doubling every couple of years, eventually we're going to run into a hard limit where we simply can't accumulate knowledge at the pace we're accumulating. And when the Ice Age comes back, that's going to stop everything. So, yeah.